Señoras, señores, autoridades, bienvenidos a la cuarta sesión del ciclo de conferencias Europe Talks. Como ya es costumbre en este ciclo, empezamos cada conferencia con el himno de Europa. Les invito, por tanto, a ponerse de pie todos para escuchar el himno de Europa. Muchas gracias. A continuación, les dirigirá la palabra respectivamente el señor Jaume Lanaspa, presidente de la oficina del Club de Roma en Barcelona, y el señor Pierre-Emmanuel Brusselmans, cónsul de Bélgica.
Bien, muchas gracias. Muy buenas tardes. Bueno, es un placer reunirnos nuevamente en este ciclo impulsado por el Consulado de Bélgica en Barcelona, que tiene además un contenido especialmente atractivo por el contenido en sí mismo y por las fechas en que se desarrolla, porque dentro de menos de un mes, en este país nos hemos acostumbrado a votar con cierta frecuencia, pero ayer votamos, pero ya en siguiendo el impulso, volveremos a votar, si Dios quiere, dentro de menos de un mes, el próximo 9 de junio, y por eso es muy importante tratar los temas que hoy trataremos. Le doy las gracias al Consulado de Bélgica por su impulso, que sigue siendo fuerte y potente, al Consulado General de Polonia y al Consulado General de Hungría, que colaboran también en el acto de hoy con sendas ponencias muy atractivas y muy interesantes, a Paul Morillas como moderador, a los ponentes, sin duda, y a todos ustedes. Y ahora cuando escuchaba el himno de Europa, que pues, lo ha introducido con acierto, pensaba qué importante es que los europeos vayamos desarrollando sentimiento de pertenencia. Qué importante es que impulsemos y que compartamos y que vivamos experiencias, quizá como la de hoy y otras parecidas, que van incrementando, porque finalmente para muchos europeos la convicción que tenemos, y quizá es oportuno recordarlo un día como hoy, la convicción que tenemos es que o nos salvamos juntos o no nos salvamos. Yo no sé si tiene razón el señor Macron cuando dice que Europa puede no salvarse, pero lo que sí parece claro es que nuestra salvación es una salvación conjunta, todos juntos, los pueblos de Europa, podemos salvarles gracias a este proyecto increíble y singular que es la Unión Europea. Bien, no insisto, que les voy a contar de Europa a ustedes que lo saben casi todo. En todo caso, muchísimas gracias. Y, señor cónsul, tiene usted la palabra.
Señor Presidente, Your Excellencies, dear colleagues, estimados amigos, amigas, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here with you again for this fourth lecture of our cycle of lectures, Europe Talks, that we initiated during the Belgian presidency of the EU. I will start by making a little bit of an advertisement for our next conferences, because we are unfortunately getting close to the end of our presidency. So on the 10th of June, we will have the pleasure to have here a journalist, Mrs. Carme Colomina, which is also a researcher, and she will speak about fake news. She's working together with CIDOP, and I'm sure that just after the elections, we will be very happy to hear from her how fake news can actually influence politics. Our last conference will be on the 18th of June. There is some advertising on the chairs for that. It will be our closing conference, and we will have 3 speakers, two of whom have worked with the former president of the EU Commission, Mr. Jacques Delors, who passed away a few months ago. That's why we decided to call it an hommage à Jacques Delors. And the third speaker He's a researcher from the Institute Egmont, the same institute as Mr. Sven Bisschop, who will speak today. And he will give you a little overview of what the Belgian presidency was able to achieve and what lies ahead of us for the next few years. Of course, the two other speakers will have a longer view. They will look at the méthode communautaire, which was initiated by Mr. Delors, and they will try to see how we can prepare or how Europe should be prepared for the future at a longer perspective. What should we do to make it still work and answer to the necessities of the day? Now, I take the opportunity, of course, to also thank our partners. Of course, la Fondation La Caixa, CIDOP, the delegation of the EU Commission, and the office of the Club of Roma here in Barcelona. I also have to mention that for the 18th of June, the last conference, the European Commission is very kindly offering us a very nice reception, which will be held afterwards here also at the CaixaForum Macaya, and that will be a way to close our conference. Today's speakers, first of all, Professor Dr. Sven Bisschop, Professor Dr. Adam Olesch, and Professor Dr. Agnes Vaz will enlighten us about geopolitics with a capital G. I have no doubt that the conflicts in Ukraine, Gaza, Ethiopia, Sudan, the Sahel, Haiti, Myanmar, and Armenia have raised our awareness to the increasing international tensions and the worsening state of international security and cooperation. But the above-mentioned wars are only the most visible part of the violent conflicts which are raging today in the world. For citizens of the EU, this worrisome evolution is hard and unpleasant wake-up. Peace is neither evident nor self-fulfilling. We might have believed that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the liberal democratic values would become the mainstream ideology, and that by sharing of similar values and a political system, the world would become a more stable and peaceful. Alas, 35 years later down the road, this seems not to be the case. Statistics of the International Crisis Center Group show that since 2012, war is on the rise. More people are dying in fighting than in decades. More leaders are pursuing their ends militarily and believe they can get away with it. So, what is happening? Our first speaker of today will bring us some light in understanding what is happening. Our two other speakers will bring a more specific insight on how geopolitics have played out for Poland and for Hungary. This year, we are celebrating the 20th anniversary of the accession of 10 countries, amongst Poland and Hungary, to the EU. This event was a shift of geopolitical importance. In the light of the current international environment, this enlargement of the EU seems even more important today. But like the audience, I am curious to learn how this is perceived by the eminent academics of Poland and Hungary, who will take the floor today. I thank you for your attention.
Muchas gracias. Damos comienzo a la sesión de hoy con tres ponentes de Bélgica, Polonia y Hungría. Después de la primera conferencia del profesor Sven Bisschop, habrá una breve sesión de diálogo con el público. Seguidamente, continuaremos con las intervenciones del profesor Adam Olesch y la profesora Agnes Vaz. La sesión de la tarde se clausura con un debate entre los tres ponentes y el público. El señor Morillas, director de CIDOP, introducirá cada conferenciante y actuará como moderador de esta sesión. Con mucho gusto cedo la palabra al señor Morillas y invito al señor Sven Bisschop de tomar asiento en el podio.
Buenas tardes. Cónsul General, muchísimas gracias por acogernos, también por la iniciativa, por haber reunido este magnífico ciclo de conferencias en ocasión de la presidencia belga del Consejo de la Unión Europea. Estimat Jaume, Muchísimas gracias por acollir-nos també. Gracias a la Fundación La Caixa, al Club de Roma, por supuesto a la representación de la Comisión Europea en Barcelona. Es un placer poder, como parte organizadora de estos encuentros, participar en la moderación de este acto. It is my pleasure to welcome an old friend and colleague from the Egmont Institute, Professor Sven Bisschop, who is also professor at the University of Ghent, multiple affiliations for exactly the same honor for me to chair this session, because Sven Bisschop is perhaps the most well-known theorist and also advisor on the European Union as a global actor, the European Union and its grand strategy in global affairs. He has been publishing multiple books on the topic, always preoccupied with the external role of the European Union, but always putting forward interesting ideas on how to improve the action of the European Union in global affairs, either when it comes to defense issues or when it comes to geopolitical positioning or when it comes to broader security aspects. So Sven, if I may call you by your first name, has been very active on this domain. We have collaborated a lot from CDOP with Egmont on multiple research projects, and he is just here not only to share his views on the topic under discussion, which is how Europe rediscovers geopolitics from Ukraine to Taiwan, but also to put forward ahead of us a bit the ideas that are part of his just published new book, or just about to be published new book in the next couple of days. This is not a new world order, so you will be able to also get more in-depth details about the topic of the conference by reading his book very, very close in time. And then we will indeed engage in another segment of the conversation, but I will introduce Adam Olesh and Agnes Vass later on, if you allow me. So let me first give the floor to Sven. I will certainly ask him a question right when he finishes, but while you listen to him, start thinking about the questions that you also want to ask him, because we'll have some short time for Q&A with Sven. So the floor is all yours. Thank you very much for being here. Welcome again to Barcelona. It will be a pleasure to listen to you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Pierre, and all the organizers involved for bringing me to Barcelona. It was perfect timing this Monday, not because it's the day after the elections here, but because it's the day after what in Belgium was a long weekend, which allowed me to come on Thursday already. And so I've been enjoying Catalonian food, Catalonian weather, Catalonian culture with my husband already for quite some time. Tomorrow we sadly have to go back. So somehow I feel, well, you know, I've seen so much art, I've eaten so much food, in my mind sort of mission accomplished. But I have to give a lecture, which I will do now, and for which I will stand maybe, if I may.
Very good.
All right.
All yours.
So I can move around a bit. The rediscovery of geopolitics, yes. I mean, some people say, geopolitics is back. Of course, geopolitics never went anywhere. It just had many people in Brussels stopped looking at it. It's a bit like the weather. The weather is always there, but you can decide not to care about it. And then we Belgians know the day will come. If you always forget about the weather and never carry an umbrella, the day will come when you will get wet. And it's the same with geopolitics. You can happily not care for it for a few years maybe, and then suddenly the thunderstorm will hit you. I think that's what happened to the EU. So it's kind of positive that we rediscover geopolitics, but we should now be careful, in my view, not to overcompensate. Not everything is about geopolitics. Strategy is about much more than geopolitics. I feel these days sometimes, in the wake of Commission President von der Leyen, everybody starts to call everything geopolitical without necessarily knowing very well what do they mean by that. Except perhaps that they think that to be geopolitical means to be more assertive somehow. What is geopolitics truly? I always use very simple definitions. I mean, I've only done political science, so geopolitics, in very simple terms, is the answer to the question, where am I? What's my geographic location? Which natural resources do I not have? So I have to import them. Where do they come from? What do I seek to export? Where does it go to? Where are my friends? Where are my enemies? And what are the lines of communication that connects it? That's geopolitics, nothing more, nothing less. It's important that you're aware of that because that creates vulnerabilities, but it also creates opportunities. But it does not determine your strategy. You still have to make choices. That's why I actually don't like the term geopolitical actor. I don't think that exists, a geopolitical actor, because it's not as if there is some ways of acting that would be geopolitical and other ways of acting that would be not geopolitical. Think of Ukraine. Ukraine is a clear geopolitical dispute between Russia and the EU. The Russians try to solve it by making war. We try to solve it by offering Ukraine an association agreement. It's not as if the Russian way is geopolitical or ours is not, or vice versa. So I always argue we have to be a geopolitically aware actor, but a strategic actor, more importantly. Meaning that strategy, you always start from your own interests. That's why we make policy, to defend our model of society. Then you have to be very aware of the environment, including the geopolitical environment. And then you make choices. How do I deal with this environment? What are my objectives? What will be my instruments? What are my resources? So this is more than geopolitics. For example, one of the biggest questions of our time, I think, is the role of China in world politics. Well, between the EU and China, there is no specific geopolitical dispute. We have many disputes about China's economic penetration, about its political influence, but geopolitically, we don't have any dispute. So the rediscovery of geopolitics, yes, but let's not get carried away either. There is more in life than geopolitics. There's more in life than academia, even as I've discovered these last few days. So second part of 3. Let me then take a quick look at what is Europe's geopolitical position these days, and how are we dealing with this strategically. And the third part, I'll try to look ahead to future strategy. I'll do a quick tour du monde clockwise, starting in Ukraine. In geopolitical terms, Ukraine was seen by the EU as a buffer state. We didn't say that because it doesn't sound so polite. We don't say, congratulations, you've been selected as the newest buffer state of the EU. It comes with a little subsidy and a visit by Charles Michel. No, but that's what it was, because nobody saw Ukraine as a future member state. The idea was always that Ukraine and the other eastern neighbors, Moldova, Belarus, and then Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, that they would remain independent states in between the EU and Russia that ideally would have good relations with both. That project obviously failed because we now know that Russia never accepted this geopolitical conception of Europe. For Russia, it seems these 6 states in their mind remain part of their exclusive sphere of influence in which the EU was not allowed to meddle. This led, as we know, to war, and now the geopolitical position has changed, in my view. If Russia wins this war, and it's our responsibility to assure that they don't, but hypothetically, if they win, then Ukraine will become a satellite state, a puppet state, which Belarus already is. They have lost their independence. But by surviving, Ukraine has become de facto a member of our security architecture. So I would argue that already today, Ukraine is a border state. It's no longer a buffer state, it's now the border of our security architecture. And we have underlined that by making it a candidate for EU membership. And we should be really clear about this. There is no precedent for this. We have never made a country that is at war a candidate for EU membership. Enlargement is, of course, in, say, a geopolitical project. You change your borders. But we have never faced a situation in which enlargement is actively undermined by a hostile power, in this case Russia. So enlargement is no longer just a question of technicalities and negotiations between us and the candidate. No, it's now a subject of power politics, and that is very new, and we must be aware of that. So because Ukraine is now our border state, obviously it's a strong interest of us that it survives as an independent state on the largest possible territory, including access to the sea. And let's be honest, we're not doing well, because we committed to support Ukraine, as a non-belligerent, meaning we're not at war with Russia, Ukraine is at war, and we as a non-belligerent provide we do everything that we can for Ukraine, except killing Russians, the nasty bit they have to do themselves, so that Ukraine can fight. But we have failed to provide them with the necessary military support, which I think more than 2 years into this war, honestly, is just shameful for us, and we should really do better, because the chance is still there that Russia wins this war, and this we should prevent. At the same time, as I said, we are not at war with Russia, and unless they directly aggress us, we should keep it like this. The idea that, for example, French President Macron put forward of sending ground troops into Ukraine, I think, is an option to be avoided. This should be solved in the end by keeping it a proxy war. Next quick stop in my geographic tour, still in Europe and in the Caucasus, we also made Moldova and Georgia candidate countries. Both countries are very vulnerable to Russian aggression or subversion, because both countries have breakaway provinces that are propped up by Russian military troops that are there on their territory and that have declared independence. So if the Russians want to, it would be really easy to open a second front there, either in Moldova or in Georgia, and to create a diversion. Which means that for us, we have to be able and willing to do for Moldova and Georgia what we are now doing for Ukraine, at the same level of resources. If not, we shouldn't have invited them to be a candidate. We can discuss whether this was a good idea. I think, Moldova lies in between the EU and Ukraine, so if Ukraine holds, Moldova will hold. Georgia is a different case. It's not actually in Europe, in pure geographic terms, so you could say, was it a smart idea to plan to extend the EU beyond Europe? It is geopolitically isolated. It does not border on Europe. It borders on Turkey, which is a candidate country, but I think that in reality, Turkey will never join the EU. Turkey is a member of NATO, of course, but at the same time, it has a very special relationship with Russia. So in case that Russia aggresses Georgia again, we have now the responsibility to support it. But how do you get there? Through the Black Sea is not allowed. The Montreux Convention forbids access for Navy ships there. So you're dependent on Turkish permission, which may or may not come. But all of this is in a way not relevant anymore, because we have accorded candidate status. So we must now prepare to support both countries, Moldova and Georgia, if they get in trouble. I continue my tour, Middle East. Middle East, had sort of really dropped down the order of priorities for EU foreign policy. Then 7th of October, the Hamas terrorist attack, of course, put it right back there. And we have reacted, many of us have reacted very clumsily, many European leaders, creating the impression that somehow we are siding quite exclusively with Israel, going against 50 years of EEC and EU foreign policy that was instrumental in having the legitimate rights of Palestine for its own state recognized. So it's very surprising that we managed to in a way, throw out of the window the acquis of 50 years of EU foreign policy, and now we are catching up. You could say that in geopolitical terms, our main interest there is, of course, that this region supplies natural resources that we need and sits right there on one of our main shipping routes through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea to the Gulf and to Asia. Now, it is a bit ironic in a way that it's the United States, which is a military ally of Israel, which we are not, that they are putting more pressure on Israel than we are, with limited results. That's another thing. And that they are also waging a much more effective regional diplomacy, trying to limit escalation. It is clear by now, I think, that the main players in the region, Saudi Arabia, Iran, are not seeking that escalation, or it would already have happened, but the chance is there. Both have their constituencies, have to take it into account. The Saudis have for the time suspended the normalization of relations with Israel that was in the making. The Iranians are acting indirectly. They are using their usual clients, Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthis in Yemen. They are using them to target the Americans and other Western players so that the Americans would put pressure on Israel. I also think that probably the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu consciously sought a degree of escalation by targeting the Iranian embassy in Damascus, inviting a direct Iranian counter-attack because he felt he was losing support, even in Washington. No better way than to get every American behind you than to be attacked by Iran. But the Iranians played it cleverly, I think. They made a big-scale demonstration, 300 drones and missiles, but they warned in advance that they were coming. So they could say, look, to their clients, look, we are acting. They could say to Israel, look, that's a relatively large-scale attack, and we have more, but this time we warned you. And then under heavy American pressure, the Israelis reacted again, but in a limited way. So for the moment, again, escalation has been managed, and the Israelis didn't really win back a lot of the support that they have lost, especially not, as we have seen, that they continue their operations now into Rafah. But everybody seems to be powerless to stop them, even though it's obvious that these operations can only make things worse. Meanwhile, though, there is another indirect escalation under, I think, incited by the Iranians, but having now probably discovered a very interesting instrument, the Houthis have basically blocked our shipping route in the Red Sea. Then the EU reacted after 3 months by deploying a maritime operation there, called Operation Aspides, 3 or 4 ships to protect our commercial shipping. Now, Paul and I have studied EU decision-making for a long time, so we know that 3 months to launch a military operation is quite fast in EU terms. But of course, if you're the captain of a ship that's being fired at by the Houthis, 3 months is rather long to wait for protection. So it's good that we do this. This is the sort of thing that we should do if you want to be taken seriously as an international player. If you want people to think that you take your geopolitical situation seriously, well, if one of your main shipping lines is cut, this is what you have to do. But we should be able to do this earlier. We were there after 3 months, the Americans after 3 weeks, and it's our trade that passes there, not the Americans. What this makes me think about also is that, maybe we have our geopolitical focus not entirely right. If you say in Brussels the words geopolitics and maritime security, everybody will think you're speaking about Indo-Pacific, another fashionable word in Brussels now. And of course, the Americans have an Indo-Pacific strategy, several European countries. But what is that, the Indo-Pacific? Does that exist, the Indo-Pacific? I sometimes wonder. I actually have a PhD student writing about it, so she would kill me if she heard me say that. But the Indo-Pacific goes all the way from Madagascar to Alaska and everything in between. I mean, is that really one region? I doubt it. If you're sitting in Australia, it makes sense. In the Indian Ocean to one side, Pacific to the other side. But for us, I think it doesn't make sense as Europeans to say that our priority is the Indo-Pacific. We don't have the resources to care about the entire Indo-Pacific, and the entire Pacific doesn't matter to us directly. What matters to us, again, is the shipping route. Suez, Red Sea, Indian Ocean, South China Sea, East China Sea, to our trade partners in East Asia. That is what matters. Now, where is that shipping route threatened? Directly. Not in Asia, right? In Asia, we have a Sino-American rivalry for dominance over the Pacific. If that escalates, it will cause collateral damage for our trade route, but it doesn't threaten it directly. In Asia, you have China that pursues territorial claims in the South China Sea. It pursues them very aggressively against the Philippines, Vietnam, and other states. These claims are totally spurious. There is no ground for them. If this escalates, it might also cause collateral damage for our shipping. But China will not directly threaten that shipping lane because it's its own shipping lane. In a way, what the Chinese are trying to do in the East and the South China Sea is to create a buffer that they control against international law, of course, to defend their maritime security. So the direct threat to that shipping lane is not in the east, but it's here in the west, in the Gulf, in the western part of the Indian Ocean, in the Red Sea. I think this is what we should focus our maritime resources on rather than on the Indo-Pacific. 2 more stops in the second part. Africa, huge continent, of course. A lot could be said of it. We could argue that from a geopolitical point of view, the real border of Europe is not here, the coastline of the Mediterranean, but it's in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa, because the Mediterranean does not cut us off from Africa, but connects us to Africa. So if we want to stabilize Southern Europe, you need to stabilize the North African littoral states, plus the Sahel and the Horn of Africa. As everybody knows, the Sahel has just been totally destabilized by a series of coups. The Russians have played into those and have been very adept at turning many governments against us. Plus, some of the coastal states, Algeria, Egypt, are also very fragile because they could very easily fall into a succession crisis. Not easy for us to win back the influence that we have lost in the Sahel because of the Russians. We have been kicked out of some countries, and again, that have been quite ignominious defeats. We are now debating in the EU whether to stay where we still are, for example, in Mali. Many countries are against that. They see it as a waste of resources. I think Spain and Belgium are some of the countries that still support that military presence, because once you go, then you're gone. Huh? And the problem is that other players are already there. Russia, also China, the Gulf states, Turkey. And we need cordial relations with our neighbors, because we have to manage migration, we have to manage our supply lanes, we have to manage the consequences of climate change. A huge challenge even to do it in cooperation with our southern neighbors. Probably impossible if we have to do it against our southern neighbors. So we have to find a way to restore influence in our southern neighborhood. Last geographic stop in the second point, I bypass Europe, so I land in Russia, Eurasia, and China. There is, of course, first of all, the Russian-Chinese relationship, about which I think we have to be very nuanced. The Chinese will not easily drop the Russians because they see them as indispensable partners against what they perceive as American dominance, but they will also never allow Russia to get them into trouble. In other words, the Chinese are trying to play, as I see it, a balanced game, doing enough for the Russians to keep them on board, but not so much that it would lead to a rupture with the United States and with Europe. And in a way, that's good news, because imagine that the Chinese would have said, oh, we will support Russia to the same extent that the Americans and the Europeans support Ukraine. Then we would now be in a new global Cold War. We and the Americans against the Chinese and the Russians. But that hasn't happened because the Chinese, obviously, I would say, prioritize the national interest. Meanwhile, Russia has basically weakened itself. They are, I mean, even if they would win the war against Ukraine, Russia will still remain a declining power, and the Chinese know that, and they're exploiting it, because having cut themselves off from the Western economy, the Russians are even more dependent on China, and China is forcing them to give them all kinds of economic concessions. So the solution of this war will obviously not come from China, but they could play a constructive role if it ever comes to negotiations. But my reading is that China is still getting used to what it means to be a great power. The Chinese are thinking what it learns to be an American. You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. The Chinese now have partners all over the world. Partners have expectations. Then sometimes these partners do things that you don't like, or your partners clash among each other. And the Chinese, whose habit is usually not to interfere, to let others fight things out, and if the others, while they are fighting, kick stuff off the table to scoop it up, you can't do that if you pretend to be a global great power. Think, for example, if you remember early in the year, there was an unexpected armed clash between Pakistan and Iran, two close partners of China, and then the Chinese intervened to say, guys, maybe cool it down a bit. Or they have new friends. Ethiopia joined the BRICS. Then a few weeks after joining the BRICS, Ethiopia starts relations with Somaliland, breakaway part of Somalia, which entertains very close relations with Taiwan. So I think the Chinese, in a way, are still adapting to what it means to be a great power. And they're struggling specifically in the Middle East, where if there's one region where it's difficult to stay friendly with everybody, it's exactly the Middle East. The other potential flashpoint in Asia is, of course, Taiwan, as I just mentioned, and it's in the title, so I should say something about it. There, too, I think one has to be nuanced about it. We are often very alarmist in Europe and in the US, as if there's, as if war will start tomorrow. But the fact is that the status quo works very well for everybody, because on the one hand, there is the political dispute about the status of the island and reunification and how that could come to pass. And the Chinese are exerting military pressure on Taiwan, having daily incursions of aircraft and navy ships. But on the other hand, China is also Taiwan's biggest trade partner, by far. There's a very close economic interaction, and Taiwanese can travel freely back and forth between the island and the mainland. So this is not a Cold War. And the Taiwanese do not wake up every morning and do not go to bed every night thinking, oh, the Chinese are going perhaps to invade. People in the island are used to this pressure. They live their lives. As long as the status quo works for everybody, it seems unlikely that China is planning to take over the island militarily, because they also have a lot to lose, especially here. Maybe less in the United States, but we see China as an enormous economic challenger, and certainly they don't always play by the rules. They also have enormous political influence, but I don't think most of us see China as a militarily aggressive power. But the day they go to war to change the status quo on Taiwan, that changes, and that will greatly affect their relations with the rest of the world. Of course, it is a symbolic issue. It's a highly ideological issue, and when things become symbols, people are not always very rational about them. But I would say from a rational, interest-based point of view, I don't see any great reason why China would seek to change the status quo by force of arms. So, if this is the geopolitical state of the world in which Europe operates, brings me briefly to my third point. How do we deal with this? A few quick bullet points. One, the basis of power is the economy. So we have to safeguard our economic prosperity. The EU has started a strategy for that, which it has called de-risking, or open strategic autonomy. It means basically, we will always have dependencies, certainly Europe. There will always be natural resources we have to import. You have to manage that and make sure that you do not become too exclusively dependent on just a single other player. And you also have to decide, what are the sectors of my economy and my infrastructure that are so critical to my success that I want to keep them under national or at least European control. So I don't want to sell them to the Chinese, but actually also not to the Americans. So de-risking, the policy has started, but I think we must think it through and accelerate it and clearly define what is now allowed under this policy, with whom, and what is not. Two, we need a positive story for our diplomacy to sell ourselves. If you travel around the world and tell other governments, isn't Russia evil? Look at what you're doing in Ukraine. Many governments say, yes, but sadly the great powers do what the great powers do, and we do not feel the urge to pronounce upon this either way. We don't consider this to be our business. If you travel around the world saying, isn't China becoming too powerful? Many other governments say, perhaps, but the Chinese are offering me this, that, and the other. What are you offering me, actually? So in addition to this justified negative message, we need a positive message. And that should be the global gateway, another policy that the EU has started. It's basically our response to China's Belt and Road Initiative, or the new Silk Road. It's our global investment program in infrastructure. And this should enable us to pursue an open door policy. An open door policy means that rather than trying to pull one state exclusively into your camp and force it to break off relations with the other powers, that you allow all states to interact freely with all other states. So this should allow us to say to third countries, look, we're not suggesting that you break off relations with China. If you want to work with China, by all means. But if you work only with China, maybe one day you'll wake up and you realize I'm no longer fully in control. So here's a good, nice European offer on the table, the global gateway, and it would be in our mutual interest to cooperate on this. So it's another policy that has started, but which we need to accelerate and demands a lot more investment. Three, we need to invest in multilateralism. There is a lot of geopolitical rivalry in this world, clearly. You have powers like Russia that see the world through a very classic geopolitical lens. So they want to conquer territory, they want to have exclusive spheres of influence, and they don't hesitate to pursue that by military means. There are other powers who don't do that. China does not. China does that to a limited extent in the South China Sea, which it claims illegally. It claims Taiwan, but everybody recognizes that Taiwan is part of China. China pursues its interests more through a geoeconomic strategy, leveraging economic power to gain political influence. And there is, of course, the United States that tries to preserve its power position. Obviously, all of this creates tensions. Some people always have the reaction to sort of build a fortress to protect yourself against these tensions. I would say we have to do the opposite. We have to keep multilateralism going. It would definitely not be in our interest that the world falls apart again in 2 or 3 camps and we have a global Cold War. We need to keep the world together. That if I have one motto for EU foreign policy, it would be that. Keep the world together. keep everybody engaged in the rules-based order. And I think we have coalition partners for that in the so-called Global South, where you have a lot of countries that would really hate to be forced to choose, basically between the Americans and the Chinese. They want to avoid that choice. They want to keep working within one multilateral system, but they also want a bigger say in that system. I think that should be our role to further that. Fourth, defense. We have to invest in our defense. One of my pet topics, maybe my real pet topic, has always been European defense. It's 25 years of EU defense policy this year. If I'm honest, it's a failure. To put it bluntly and briefly, it has failed. We do not have more European military capability than when we started, and what we have is not more integrated than when we started. But I do think we need to do something, because meanwhile, American strategy has changed. As in, we spent 25 years pretending we're having an EU defense policy. Meanwhile, under Obama, so not because of Trump, under Obama, American policy changed, and they said our priority number one is now China. So I assume that if ever, hypothetically, there would be war at the same time in Europe and Asia, the Americans would say, dear European friends, don't worry. As soon as we have defeated China, we'll come and help you. But until then, please hold the line against Russia. Are we capable of doing that? Perhaps with very great effort, a lot of improvisation, and therefore a lot of casualties. In other words, we still have to make a great effort to reinvest in our defense, through NATO, I would say, but using the EU instruments that we have, such as the European Defence Fund, to make sure that all the European allies in NATO together constitute a complete and coherent force package. Because now all the European allies together, or all the EU member states together, do not have a complete set of forces. We can only really be fully operational if the Americans provide the enabling capabilities, intelligence, transport, command and control, missiles, and so on and so forth. So if the Americans don't come, or they come late or in fewer numbers, we're kind of stuck, and that I think has become an unacceptable strategic risk. So we should invest in our defense, align our efforts, and invest in those enabling capabilities, so that in the end, ideally, all the European allies together need only one American to be operational. SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, always an American general, that ought to be the only one that we need. Two more bullet points. One is solidarity. My plea is about geopolitics, it's about strategy. It's basically for a European realpolitik. Why do we have a strategy? Because we have interests to defend. That always comes first. But we are a rich continent. Not every individual European citizen is rich and wealthy enough. That's another debate. But in the aggregate, we are rich. So I do think, in addition to pursuing our interests, we are rich enough to show solidarity. In some cases where our interests are not directly at stake, to show solidarity with those who fall victim to the power politics of others. Final point, and that's my conclusion. All of this we can only do, I think, if there is a change of mentality. We are in a world of great powers, and it's to a very large extent the interaction between those great powers that determines the course of world politics. It's China, Russia, the United States. We have to decide, are we one of that club of great powers, or is our role to be the sort of secondary player whose main job is to be the most loyal ally of another great power, the United States? We cannot choose. Ever since the EU has been created, Maastricht, we have been oscillating, hesitating between the two positions. Are we an independent player, or are we the most loyal ally of the Americans? Or can we combine both? As long as we don't know that, we will never be a really consistent player. My preference is clear. We should be one pole of the multipolar world, one great power among the others. Of course, still in alliance with the Americans, but a much more balanced alliance. And then we can follow the beautiful strategy that I have just outlined. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Sven, for covering all this ground on geopolitics and also on Europe's role therein. I have one question, but before I ask it, and perhaps there's already plenty of questions, so I won't ask mine. Is there anyone who would like to intervene? Otherwise, I'll ask mine. There's one there. Yeah, okay, so let me ask mine and I'll turn to you, okay? So that there may be others.
Privilege of the chair.
Privilege of the chair, exactly. Something that I was very interested in, and is right at your concluding remarks, is precisely this idea of the change of mentality of the European Union. Because to a certain extent, one could say that this change of mentality is very much running against the same DNA of the European Union, who was created in the first place to escape the logic of power, right? We decided that we would integrate our countries, that we would give sovereignty to Brussels precisely to avoid power politics among ourselves, but in general as a way of being in the world, right? We were hoping at some point that if our story was a successful story, then others would look at us and say, okay, we have to emulate that experiment. We have to create little European unions all over the world because that is the best way to act peacefully in international affairs. So this change of mentality runs very much against the idea that, that we need to get involved into power politics, right? And this is a contradiction in terms from the beginning, right? It's difficult to convey to the Europeans that now the game is about power. Yesterday it was about cooperation, or it was about friendship. Huh? So that is a big change of mentality. But what it happens, and that's what I would like to ask you, is that we are seeing these two sort of messages coming in front of us, and particularly looking at the elections coming in June, two sort of messages that are completely different. On the one hand, you have multiple voices saying, listen, we've done well. We have managed the pandemic quite well. We have secured our vaccines. We have built the next generation EU. We are providing assistance to Ukraine. We've done tremendous steps if we compare to what we've done so far. So in a sense, there's this sort of complacency, there's sort of self-congratulatory way in which the European Union has reacted. And on the other hand, you have all these other sort of messages saying Europe can die. Europe is really, I mean, at the very end of its existence, unless it really comes to terms with the idea of power, and Macron is a very explicit voice in that second understanding. Is this, and this is the question, is this really the way to convince Europeans that we need to make that change in mentality? Or is the first, come on guys, you've done well, keep working, this is the most promising step, or not? Or on the other hand, the best promising step forward is saying you are in real danger. What is the best way to convince our citizens that this change of mentality needs to take place?
I guess it also depends which member state you're talking to, because if you, I mean, a few weeks ago I was in Vilnius and Riga. You don't need to convince anybody. They all think they are in real danger, right? So that you already know, and they think we, more to the west, are sort of, they don't understand why we don't understand. But does that message appeal the further you move away from Russia? It's not clear to me. Even though, for example, even in Belgium, I've seen a certain switch in the public opinion. Defense has never been a big priority. For the first time now, we have two parties, two mainstream parties who are running with a very strong program on defense, which at least means that they think it's a vote winner to ask for defense investment. I have not seen that at any time in my career so far. So there is a certain switch. But I still have to say, I still believe that the more convincing rhetoric is the positive rhetoric in the sense that a program should propose something to do, not only say we're defending against this, but also what are we for? What do we want to achieve? And make clear that to achieve something also needs power, right? I think that's still somewhat a problem in the debate, that some people equate power politics somehow with nastiness, you know? As if the moment you have power, you grab a province from a neighbor, or you colonize another part of the world, which is clearly what we did in the past. But I think my message would be no, the EU can develop a positive project to keep the world together, But if you don't have power, you're never going to do anything, right? And that's why I always say realpolitik, it has a negative connotation for many people. Many people hear realpolitik and they think, the end justifies the means. But originally realpolitik was a positive concept, but it just means every end requires means. You can have many beautiful dreams, but without resources and without power to mobilize those resources, you can do what I do. You can write books. You might even sell a few, but it ends there. So off the cuff, I would still go for the more positive message.
Excellent. Thanks very much. So, please, your question. There's another one here. Perhaps I can gather two, or well, depending on over there. Allà, a la dreta, sí, sisplau. Bueno, a l'esquerra, teva.
Hello, my name is Nico. I hope you hear me. I actually have two questions. I hope I can raise two questions. One, two. A little better now, no?
Yeah,
so I actually have two questions. One is related to Ukraine. I would like to know, for example, from what you mentioned, what is the benefit now for the Europeans and for Ukrainians with the strategy that Europe took together with, let's say, the rest of the Western world, with the United States, of arming Ukraine and maybe not insisting on a peace agreement and a solution? So what are the current benefits 2 years and a little bit more into conflict? And the second question would be related to what you said about what's currently happening in Gaza. You said currently everybody seems to be powerless. So I would like to know why they're in that conflict. Why, for example, there's a whole set of activities that were applied for some other conflicts, including Ukraine, different kind of sanctions, maybe stoppage of trade deals and things like that. Why is that not applicable here? So that's my question. Thank you.
You want to take these two, or? Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, on Ukraine, look, I think until 2014, the first war, the annexation of the Crimea, the West could have decided to abandon Ukraine. We could have said, or clearly it matters a lot to the Russians. Are we willing to pay the price for that? No, you can have it. But we didn't. After 2014, after the annexation, the EU signed the association agreement. Then it was the president's refusal before the war to sign that led to the war to a large extent. So if after the 2014 annexation we signed the association agreement, anyway, at that point we committed ourselves to Ukraine's survival. Because if then you go back on that, then it's an enormous loss for your credibility. Of course, I don't think many people thought in 2014 that the chance of a second war was that likely, but we committed ourselves to Ukraine. Now, when the second war came, 2022, a lot of people assumed that Russia would have an easy win, including Putin himself, obviously. But that proved a big mistake. And so by surviving, Ukraine then pulled us in because we have that association agreement, right? And then we tried to calibrate our support by saying we're not going to join this war, but we do have an interest in Ukraine surviving as an independent state, not only because that would add strategic depth on our side, but also because if we fail, then I assume Russia will not stop there. I don't see such a direct threat to another NATO or EU member state, but I do think if Russia would win in Ukraine, then they would say, Moldova, Georgia, the other former Soviet republics. So I do think it is in our interest to hold Russia here. Where exactly is another question. I think the problem is, don't forget, Russia is still on the offensive. So the Ukrainians cannot just stop fighting. The Russians continue to attack. And I feel that if we now force Ukraine to negotiate, I mean, we can do that. If we say, if you don't negotiate, no more weapons. Well, the Americans can do that. Before you can threaten to stop giving weapons, you have to give them. If we force them, then I think the Russians would say, they're about to drop Ukraine, so now is the time not to negotiate, but to go all the way, and we can take all of it. So I think as long as the Ukrainians think that it makes sense for now to hold out and to fight, it is our responsibility to arm them, given that Russia remains on the offensive. Of course, the ideal end state would be that Ukraine manages to liberate all of its territory. That may not be militarily possible, and so there is a large chance that the conflict, one way or another, will end with, sadly, Russia still occupying part of Ukraine. But we'll see where it goes. On Gaza, very briefly, Why are we not doing much more than for Gaza? Because there is not that unity on policy towards Israel and Palestine that there is on Ukraine. Basically, as long as Germany and a couple of other EU member states continue to almost unconditionally support any Israeli government, whatever it does, it means we can never use the leverage that in theory we have, because we could exert enormous economic pressure on Israel. But there is no agreement, so all that we can do is for individual member states. I think both Spain and Belgium governments have actually done that, to make very clear statements. But yeah, we are a single market, so we cannot individually adopt economic sanctions. I regret that, but so I'm just outlaying what I see as the facts of the case.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. Over here, sí, aquí.
Sí, tomando como definición.
Pero un segundo, por favor, que se ponga el auricular.
Just to make sure I get you.
Tomando como definición geopolítica la que nos ha aportado y entendiendo que hablar de actores puede ser incorrecto, ¿no da la sensación de que hay un actor invisible que es el cambio climático con los movimientos que pueden generar en la geopolítica por desplazamiento de masas de población, más el impacto que pueda tener en el territorio? Esto por un lado. Y ya que hemos hablado de multilateralidad, ¿es más los esfuerzos en positivo por la multilateralidad o el evitar los vetos que se producen de forma continua en la geopolítica? Es decir, una acción es en positivo, la otra la podemos encontrar en reducir impactos que pueden haber. Gracias.
Yes, thank you. Climate change, I always find that difficult to come up with how to say. I'll put it like this, I do think climate change will have a multiplier effect on many of the problems that we have been discussing so far. But the answer simply is the same in terms of strategy, defense policy, the answer still is the same. So I think climate change has a multiplier effect of security problems, but the answer to the security problems doesn't change, it remains the same. And of course, have an effective climate policy. So in that sense, this whole topic of the climate security nexus, I'm usually not so convinced by it because I do not see what concretely we then do. I mean, what do the armed forces then do differently, or what does our foreign ministry do differently because climate change has a multiplier effect? I don't see it, except pursuing a climate policy. And on multilateralism, I'm not sure I fully got the picture, but for sure, I have to say, I don't see multilateralism only as a way of, in a negative or in a protective way, of guarding against tensions, but multilateralism keeps the world economy going. And I think the core of it is the global economic infrastructure, institutional infrastructure, that keeps the world together. That is no guarantee against war. We have seen it in 1914, but that does create a really big obstacle against a great power, a full-fledged great power war. Thank you.
Excellent. Any other question? There are two more. Perhaps I can gather both if you can be brief on your questions, because we are starting to run late. Yes, please.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm also from Belgium. Actually, I'm a professor from geopolitics and from the European Union here in Spain and both in Belgium. Okay, so a topic that interests me. What I missed a bit today was United States. Okay, especially taking into consideration that, well, Trump may come back as a president, and the question is simple: what kind of influence do you think that's going to have? Because there can be a lot of changes, or do you think it's not going to be that bad at all? So.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Maybe we can take the other one. It was over there in the middle, yes.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the conference. My question is very brief. Yes, of course, all this change in this paradigm is becoming more and more important. But for me, there is turning point, which was the declarations of Donald Trump, that during his campaign, he said that he could probably leave the NATO and Europe alone if countries doesn't start to achieve their budget. So I would like just a brief point about that, about what extent these values are in the core of the European Union, or this is a massive reaction that we are taking. Thank you.
Thank you.
In a way, two sides of the same question. I mean, one thing is to say that this goes back to just said, goes back to Obama in a way. Well, there's been a debate about burden sharing forever. I mean, basically since NATO was created, the Americans have said do more. But since Obama, we know that we are no longer priority number one. China and Asia is priority number one. So we know that, and plus American defense planning has changed from focusing on the ability to fight 2 wars to fight 1 great power war at a time. So we know that will be the one with China. So in a way, Trump or no Trump, this has been American strategy since Obama, and had we been smarter, we would have been preparing for it militarily, but we haven't. And you could say, objectively speaking, because now everybody is talking about Trump, and I agree it's very relevant, but yeah, he has been president, of course. And what did it change? What did we do more? Not so much. Everybody already told, okay, well, it's only 4 years, hopefully. Let's sit it out. And in fact, my big fear is that if Trump is re-elected, you will see the same reaction that we saw when he was first elected. Namely, that instead of pulling together the Europeans, that quite a few Europeans will rush to Washington to try and deepen their bilateral relationship and to try to get some bilateral assurance from Trump, which will be worth nothing because the man himself doesn't know what his policy is, and the man himself doesn't know whether what he says in the morning will be his point of view in the evening, sadly. But I fear very much that's what we will do. What we ought to do, really briefly, is to beef up our contribution to NATO so that, to put it bluntly for the sake of the argument, so that if Trump is elected and the day after, he pulls every American out of NATO, the thing still works, because we have prepared to fill the gaps. That is what we ought to do. And so not build a European army under the EU, but beef up our contribution to NATO, but use the EU instruments to allow us to do this. That would be sort of my view. In a way, ironically, Trump could be inspired by de Gaulle. De Gaulle in '66, he kept France in NATO, but he pulled out all French troops from the military structure. And Trump might do the same if you want. Leaving the treaty is not so easy, but calling back all his guys, that is in a way easier done.
Excellent. So I think we've come to the end of this first segment of our conversation tonight. Thank you very much, Sven, for sharing your views. It's been an absolute pleasure to listen to you and to keep learning from you. So thank you very much, and join me, please, in a big applause to our speakers. Thank you. All right, so now we'll be moving into the second part of our session tonight, and this second part is held in collaboration with the Consulate General of Poland and Consulate General of Hungary here in Barcelona to discuss the 20th anniversary of the biggest enlargement that the European Union has ever had. That was the enlargement that brought Poland and Hungary within the European Union, but also many other countries in 2004, and it's still a subject of discussion, particularly at the time when, as Sven has reminded us, we are promising other new countries to join the European Union. So in order to assess whether that enlargement was successful, it's very interesting if we can look at the experience of Poland and Hungary. So let me invite Professor Adam Holeš to take the floor, and then Professor Agnes Vaz as well from Hungary. I will introduce them both, and I believe Adam will speak first, right? So Adam is a research fellow in IBEI, the Barcelona Institute for International Affairs, a sister institution of CIDOB, also associate lecturer at Universitat Pompeu Fabra, working on Poland for a long time and coming to these days to terms with this successful story or missing parts of the successful story of the enlargement of the European Union. So Adam will speak first and then I will introduce our second speaker.
Should I speak from here? Okay.
As you wish.
Okay. Because I step in a very big footsteps. It's not very usual that a professor can speak out of a scratch 45 minutes without using a paper. I had some papers. Thank you for making it so difficult. Great talk, excellent. Dear consuls, dear president, thank you for the invitation. Dear colleagues, dear guests, dear students, welcome. I'm very happy that you're here. As Paul mentioned, I will talk about the 20th anniversary of the Polish accession to the European Union. Okay? And I would like to start with a comparison. Okay? I see in the audience we have many local people, Spaniards, Catalan, right? How can you, in which point do we find Poland right now? And I think the comparison with Spain, it's a good way to start, right? Because Spain entered the European Union in '86. 20 years later, we are in the year 2006. Okay, 2006 in Spain. Let's remember, very energetic country, economy booming. Spain, 2 years later, 2008, becomes the member of G20. Very progressive government. Okay, same-sex marriage introduced in Spain 2005 after the Netherlands and Belgium. Okay, we have a very energetic society. Okay, and then we will talk later about what happened 2 or 3 years later. Poland entered the European Union on the 1st May of 2004. Okay, right now we celebrate the 20 years. It took a little bit longer Poland to join the European Union. Spain entered, when we take as a starting point of the regime change, the '78 constitution, it was 8 years. Poland needed 14. Why? Mainly because of the economic backwardness. It was much more complicated. The real socialist economy, that was something different than the Franco dictatorship in the economic terms, right? The Western states didn't really want that Poland enters fast, not because they were afraid, but maybe it's too big and too poor. So let's look what happened in the last 20 years. And maybe I usually do interactive things. Who from the audience have been already to Poland? Okay, around 25%. Okay, that's very nice. Please visit. Why? And those of you who went to Poland, maybe for example in the 90s, if you travel around Europe, in Poland you can see the biggest change. How positive European Union membership can be. Okay, the Poland of the 90s, it's gray. Okay, for example, Hungary had Budapest, the Czech Republic had Prague. These were already developed cities, right? Poland, under the communist rule in the 80s, it was a very huge economic crisis. And since the entrance to the European Union in 2004, we see an economic boom. What happened? The GDP doubled. 2021, Poland surpassed Portugal. And there are economic experts saying that it will surpass Spain in 2025. Okay, so we have very important developments. Poland's unemployment rate right now lies, it's around 2.8%, as in October 2023. Okay, Poland had an unemployment rate of around 20. We know it, people who live in Spain, we know it. We also had to fight with this problem. Poland, when it joined 2004, the Western states were so afraid of the Polish workers that they blocked the markets. For example, Germany and Austria. Who allowed the Polish workers to come was the UK. Okay, so we had really huge problems. This changed right now. Very low unemployment rate, and it attracts foreign workers also from the European Union, something which was very difficult to imagine 10 or 15 years ago. Then Poland is one of the countries which best uses European Union funding. Okay? It uses Spain was also good, but Poland apparently, when you look at empirical data, did it a little bit better. No? Infrastructure, mainly highways, renovating of the cities. Poland didn't invest so much, for example, in trains as Spain did. Okay? It was more the highways. Thanks to this success, the Polish society is known as one of the most pro-European in Europe for decades already. Over 90% saying that they are in favor of the European Union integration. Okay, so what was the impact of Poland on the European Union? Until now, Poland was quite shy, okay, in the European structures. We have two Polish politicians which really did an impact. One of them is Donald Tusk, or Donald Tusk in Polish. Maybe can we switch the pictures, because I broke this to here.
You have this here.
Oh, okay.
You want to use it, yeah.
Donald Tusk, who was the president of the European Council between 2014 and 2019. I mean, most of them will know it. By the way, I stole the picture from the page of CDOP.
That's fine.
And the other one is Jerzy Buzek, who was the president of the European Parliament and was also responsible for the European Union energy policy. Okay? Why is Jerzy Buzek important? He was one of the first who warned of the energy dependency on Russia. Okay? And he developed already some alternative mechanisms before the full-scale invasion in 2022. Therefore, after 2022, for some countries, it was easier to get rid of the energy supply from Russia. Looking at policies, in which fields did Poland influence European Union policy? And here, this fits quite well with the conference. There are two things. One is enlargement, the European neighborhood policy towards Eastern Europe, which when you look at some empirical data and some analysis, it was a bit more successful than towards the southern states. Okay, for example, the Eastern Partnership was a real success. Poland was also, we talk a lot about Ukraine here, Poland was also a strong advocate that Ukraine joins the Western structures. Okay, Poland is here very important. I will come back to that a little bit later. And the second point, besides enlargement policies, this neighborhood policy, is the question of security. Poland worked already many, many years ago now that the Putin regime can somehow get into a strong confrontation to the European Union. Okay, Poland was allowed at. It was not really taken seriously. And we all remember the 24th February 2022. It was not sure if Putin will attack or not, right? The CIA, the Americans apparently said this will happen, but we remembered what happened with the Iraq war. No? But in that moment, when Putin invaded Ukraine 2022, something switched, and Poland started to be taken seriously in the European Union. So let's take a look maybe on things which didn't go well, because not everything was a big success. So the Polish society, for example, is very mobile. It's getting richer, but it's not getting so rich, but it's not leaving the country for moving to Western Europe. Okay, there are still some migration flows now which dry out Poland, and this is in general now because we also take a look at the 2004 enlargement. This is a big problem in Central and Eastern Europe. Okay, but qualified people leave no, and go to the Western states. Then Poland and other Central and Eastern European countries are more recipients than creators. Okay, so they don't really have a voice yet in the European Union. Okay, this is a problem, and this is also somehow perceived by the populations. Now, for example, when some proposal about institutional reforms are made, they are usually made by France on Germany. Okay, the experts usually come from these two countries, right? And experts from Central and Eastern Europe are not invited. And there is something new which happened in the last 5 to 6 years with the economic development, with some kind, the building up of a well-being. Central and Eastern Europe started to be tired of imitating the West. Okay, this is a concept which was developed by Ivan Krastev, who is a Bulgarian political scientist, saying that the Central Europeans right now want to develop something on their own. Why? Because copying the West usually always positions you in a second position, right? So right now, in this moment, we are in something like a moment, right, where Central and Eastern Europe wants to develop something new. And here maybe some ideas what Poland, what the European Union and maybe new future states could learn from Poland. No? And one thing where Polish academics are really pointing to this thing is that national identity and European identity are not exclusive. Okay? Patriotism is something positive, while nationalism can be a negative force. Okay? So Poland thinks that here it can bring something to the European integration. Second is the focus on security. Okay? Poland was insisting on possible dangers from Russia, and right now it rides somehow on this wave, right? Germany was not eager to cut off all the energy supplies from Russia 2022, beginning 2023. It happened also now because there was a very big pressure from Central and Eastern Europe. And the last point, and this is maybe a thing now because we talk also about enlargement, Poland has shown that in order to use successfully European Union funding, cohesion funding, other types of funding, you need a very solid state structure, okay? And only in this moment, you can really take advantage of the European integration. There are other states, for example, like Romania or Bulgaria, where this state structure did not exist, right? And where the effects of the European Union funding were not so big, like, for example, in Poland. Besides that, the effects of the European integration, like the positive influence of European Union funding, should be distributed to all people. Because, for example, when we look at the UK, United Kingdom, right, it was somehow in the European Union, but the benefits went more to the upper class, to the Londoner city, okay, to the higher class. And what finally followed was the Brexit, which was maybe one of the most complicated episodes in European integration until now. Okay, I'll leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you. Okay, so for another vision, now on the side of Hungary, we have Agnes Vask. She's the director of, research director of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs and a well-known speaker also on the vision on Europe from her country of origin, Hungary. So would you like to step in here?
Yes,
or?
Yes.
Okay, very good.
I also have a presentation. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's a great pleasure and honor to talk in front of such a prestigious audience about the Hungarian perspective of the EU enlargement 20 years ago, in such a beautiful building and in such a vibrant city like Barcelona is. When I was asked to talk about the Hungarian perspective on the EU enlargement, I asked myself what should I highlight and how should I somehow summarize the Hungarian perspective, and I decided to bring my personal experiences from that period. And I brought you two experiences of mine. One will describe the general mood of the Hungarian society of that time, just to show you the feelings. And the other one will be my very personal experience. So my first question is, how many of you have visited Hungary? Okay.
Much more than Poland.
It's more than, yeah, it's definitely more than Poland.
You shouldn't have asked.
Okay, so on the 1st of May 2004 at midnight, the sand measuring time from the moment of EU accession of Hungary began to roll in the time wheel set up right next to Hero Square in Budapest on the site of a former statue of Lenin. Some Hungarians were predicting Western living conditions and wages in few years. Others were worried about whether we could eat poppy seed and have backyard pig slaughters at home. So my personal experience from that time is that I'm a high school student. I'm starting my high school studies in a very small town close to the Hungarian border, but it's outside of the territory of Hungary. So I am a member of a Hungarian minority community of that country. And in that period, there were huge concerns whether that country can be joined the European Union together with Hungary. So starting my high school studies, my parents motivated me to work hard because I will be able, hopefully, to apply for prestigious Hungarian universities or maybe to Western Europe. So I've got a book. It was a history atlas. And the gift giver wrote a very special message into that book. That only a united Europe can bring the solution, and the word solution is in capital. So since then, a lot of things happened. For example, the time wheel has disappeared from the city park because of reconstructions, and the poppy seed bread has become one of the most popular traditional Hungarian sweets among Spanish, Belgian, Polish, Dutch or German tourists visiting Budapest. And in many places, the pig slaughter has become part of the rural tourism that is maintained in several villages through EU funds. And as a footnote, I never ever expected that I will be here talking in front of you as a research director of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, so that can be put on the list of EU achievements as well. So the balance of Hungary's accession to the EU can be seen as positive, even if the expectations and desires or imaginations of the early 2000s have now been revealed to be illusion. Just very briefly about the road to the EU and how Hungary proceeded. So already in the late communist era, Hungarian government went as far as in their efforts to improve relations with the European community as it was possible to do it in that time, taking the lead among the Central and Eastern European countries in this respect. In July 1988, trade and cooperation agreement between Hungary and the European community was concluded just 1 week after the European Community and the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance of the Eastern Bloc has established diplomatic relations. So Hungary was very fast on this track. It was generally accepted that this was the most far-reaching agreement that the European Community was likely to sign with any of these Central European countries. But with the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union itself, the scope of Hungarian foreign policy expanded radically. The first post-communist prime minister, József Antal, used this new independence to define his government's basic goals in foreign policy in the early 1990s as Euro-Atlantic integration, good relations with other countries of East and Central Europe, and the representation of the interests of ethnic Hungarians abroad, living in the countries neighboring with Hungary, primarily in Romania, Slovakia, and Ukraine. So the accession process with Hungary started in 1991 when the bloc concluded an association agreement with Hungary. 2 years later, the European Council in Copenhagen defined the conditions for the accession of the Eastern European countries, which included political and economic criteria such as stable democratic institutions, the rule of law, human and minority rights, and the functioning market economy. Preparing for membership and conducting the negotiations extended over 4 legislative terms in Hungary, with each election in this period bringing a change of government. However, the accession process did not suffer major setbacks, indicating robust potential, even if there was not necessarily agreement on the acceptable conditions for achieving it among these political parties. The practice of bilateral relations or agreements on good neighborly relations was reinvented by Germany after 1991. However, Hungary used also a similar policy with 5 of its neighbors to improve the situation of the Hungarian minorities. And parallel to this trend, the European Union has also promoted a policy aimed at guaranteeing stability in Central and Eastern Europe through bilateral agreements on good neighbor lines. Here you can see which countries had bilateral agreements with which country, and you can see that Hungary was quite active in that. So in 1999, the EU named the 6 countries with which concrete accession negotiations could begin, namely Estonia, Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovenia, and Cyprus. But it also made it clear that the negotiations could be longer than it was expected. So the then Orbán cabinet launched the regional diplomatic initiative, the first stage of which was the warming up of the Visegrad cooperation, showcasing that the Central European countries are able to cooperate with each other and showing that they have good and stable relations with each other so that they can join the European Union. Accession negotiations were successfully concluded in 2002, and in Hungary there was a referendum in 2003. None of the parties at that time, except the then far-right party, had EU-skeptical messages. The aim was to make it a successful non-partisan issue. So all parliamentary parties campaigned in favor of accession, and it was a very successful campaign because, as you can see, the turnout was not that high, but the majority of Hungarian voters supported Hungary to joining the European Union. So, as the result, Hungary joined the EU together with other countries in 2004. Here I show you some pictures from the archives. This is the message of Viktor Orbán that Hungary joined the European Union. And these are sometimes funny, sometimes a little bit like not that funny front pages of newspapers from that day in Hungary. So what does the EU mean to Hungary? This is, you most probably recognize, the building of the Hungarian National Museum. There is an exhibition titled 1,100 Years in Europe and 20 Years in the EU. So there is no doubt that the EU membership has brought countries countless values to our daily lives, beyond economic catch-up, freedom to work, study, travel, improve living standards, security, stability, and much more. When it comes to the evaluation of EU membership, we cannot avoid numbers and economic development. So almost 80% of Hungary's total exports are destined for the European Union, while the EU share of total domestic imports is close to 70%. According to Eurostat, 77% of the volume of Hungarian exports in 2022 were produced by foreign-owned companies, which is data that shows how Hungary is integrated into the European economy. Between 2004 and 2022, Hungary received more than 83 billion in EU funding. So the country has ranked third in the EU in terms of cohesion policy support per capita over the last 20 years. According to EU statistics, 80% of all public investments between 2004 and 2024 was invested in the Hungarian economy thanks to the EU transfers. Within capital attraction, the government has a specific objective nowadays to diversify where investments come from. In practice, this looks like Asia is playing an increasing role, most recently with the arrival of Chinese and Korean battery companies and electric car manufacturers to Hungary. However, given the numbers, it is also clear that even the truly growing share of Asian FDI in general is not even half of European FDI at this moment. So in other words, we can talk a lot about, yes, here is the explanation. So we can talk a lot about opening up to the East, and we can even motivate that. However, based on the numbers at this moment, Hungary is embedded in the Western world economy, and this is unlikely to change in the near future. There is a very special aspect of the Hungarian accession to the EU, and I would say a few words about that as I am personally involved. And that's the question of Hungarian minority communities living in neighboring countries around Hungary. The members of these communities are valuable to Hungary, which is why the Hungarian state is devoting energy and financial resources to support the prosperity of these communities. European values such as cultural and linguistic diversity and the values of national communities deserve recognition and protection in the EU, and Hungary totally supports this approach. The EU accession of Hungary itself was a dilemma within the Hungarian politics because the borders between Serbia or Romania became external Schengen borders as well, which divided Hungarian communities from the kin state. However, the EU membership of Hungary and its neighboring countries has brought about positive changes in many respects, but no comprehensive solution has been achieved for the problems of Hungarian minorities living abroad. That's why Hungary also supported the accession of other neighboring countries or their ambition to join the European Union. However, besides some positive effects, it must be noted that following the EU accession, the situation of Hungarian communities has become a little bit worse in certain countries, but let's hope that it will be developing. Going back to the accession and before the accession, there was a problematic question because some political powers within Hungary were not supporting the fact that the Czech Republic and Slovakia would also like to join together with Hungary to the European Union, and that's because of the Beneš decrees. However, here is a quote from Orbán saying that this question cannot be contextualized or cannot be approached from the context of the EU accession. It has to be handled differently, and that's why Hungary also supported and partnered the accession of these countries as well. And why I'm talking about this when I just mentioned the economic effects of the Hungarian EU membership, the reason is that Hungary contributed and supported the accession of neighboring countries. However, in case of countries that are not able to join to the European Union because of some reason, Hungary is also supporting those communities and in this way the economic prosperity of that region. So one good example is the Hungarian agriculture. because Hungarian agriculture and Hungarian farmers have experienced a level of wealth creation and development through EU accession that is basically unprecedented in history. And the know-how accumulated in this way is being also transferred towards regions where Hungarians living, but those countries are not members of the European Union. There are two examples. One is this Prosperitate program, which is aiming Vojvodina region, and the other one is the Egan Ede program, which is aiming Zakarpattia region in Hungary. And I just read a research. I was not able to put it here, but there was a research analyzing the results of this Egan Ede program, and the participants, these Hungarian business owners, told to these researchers that the support they received through these funds is good not only for their own businesses, but it is also helping them to integrate to the broader supply chain and have business and trade-related relations not only with Hungarian, but also, for example, with Ukrainian business partners as well. So Hungary and the Hungarian membership in the EU can be summarized as a success. And just a few words about the Hungarian EU Council presidency, which will start soon. And it will have a very special character in that it will take place at a time of institutional change, because following the EP elections, the new president of the European Commission could be nominated, then the new European Parliament will be formed, and the hearings of the commissioners designate will start in September, and the new European Commission could take office on 1st of November, hopefully. So basically we can say that the Council of the European Union will be the point of stability of this period, and Hungary would like to ensure the continuity of EU institutional activity. The Hungarian presidency will aim to have strong policy priorities and to provide consensus responses to all challenges. The EU is facing serious competitiveness challenges, so most probably it's going to be one of the most important priorities of the Hungarian presidency. And then the focus will also be on defense and security policy and the strengthening of the European security and defense policy based on the European defense industry, tackling demographic challenges, managing migration, especially the external dimensions, and also the enlargement and to keep the Western Balkans region close to the EU will be one of the aims of the Hungarian presidency. And the program will be based on the importance of cooperation in the European Union. And this position also applies to the European Parliament elections. And noting that the elections are likely to be followed by significant political changes, we will see. But Hungary will act as a fair mediator and will seek common solutions to common European problems. So although in retrospect, most of the expectations associated with EU membership seem to be a little bit naive, and the exaggerated dreams have now been buried, even after a minor setback, the EU is still one of the most popular and most important political institutions among Hungarians. These are data from last autumn saying by Eurobarometer that 76% of Hungarians think that the EU has an impact on their daily lives. 54% think that the EU membership is a good thing, and 73% think that the country has benefited from it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you very much, Agnes, for shedding light into Hungarian perspective, but also thanks to Adam for bringing in the Polish perspective. Now we have some time before 8 p.m. for some remaining questions from the audience. Who would like to say a few words on both presentations, on the state of play of both countries? Over there, one question, please, here in the front.
So my question would be for both of you. We know that there are some, especially lately, ideological differences between the governments of both Poland and Hungary and the rest, let's say, more liberal countries within Europe. So how has that actually affected your perspective within the European Union, potential, and your place right now? Did you feel the effect, especially two of you, because you're obviously in it, so you know more than let's say, a regular citizen?
Thank you. Would you like to answer to this first? Or?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, and then I'll collect another question.
I would also bring one of my personal experiences. Despite we feel that on a governmental level, there are some distances, bigger distances between these two governments. However, it's important to understand that right now the Polish government is a coalition, so there are different political parties. But based on my experience and on our level, I would say, on the level of researchers, we also see that communication is needed. And when we explain our stance or the Hungarian stance, and then the Polish researcher or expert can react to that, and then we listen to their opinion or stance, then we can bring these closer to each other. So I would say that more communication might be good.
Adam, would you like to?
Yeah, from my side, yeah, this is completely true what you meant. Poland from 2015 to 2023 was considered as a backsliding country in a rural conflict with the European Union. However, for the Poles, it's never that the whole population is in favor of a government, right? So in Poland, the PiS government, 2015, came into power. Some scholars call it something like an electoral accident because the left couldn't come in. However, later they introduced some kind of social policies which were liked by the voters. And 2019, they got really a very good result. And this is where really the rule of law conflict with the European Union started. However, as you know, in October 2023, there were elections in Poland, and one of these guys, Donald Tusk, won the elections, right? And right now, Poland is a completely different moment. Right now, Poland is in a moment where they want to revive the so-called Weimar Triangle. This was created in '91, France, Germany, and Poland. However, Poland in '91 was too weak, mainly economically. Right now, after catching up economically, now Poland positions themselves in this triangle as a symmetric partner, right? And this is one thing which I left for. Thank you for the question, for the Q&A. Right now, this is the first time in Polish history when Poland can become a really important player in European politics.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Consul General, please.
Thank you very much for your intervention and for the Polish and Hungarian perspective. Now, as you just mentioned, there have been times where the Polish government didn't completely see eye to eye with most of the European governments, and let's face it, it can also sometimes be the case with the Hungarian government. Now, we all have our internal elections, we all have policies and parties which have their own dynamic. But I was wondering, when we look at what is happening in Ukraine and the new, let's say, way how the Russian policy is starting to be developed in the neighboring countries, wouldn't that be maybe one serious drive or serious engine to actually push the European governments, the Hungarian government and also the Polish government, as to try to find more consensus and to do more things together? Because let's face it, Russia is 130 million people, strong army, even if they are getting weaker and weaker. But if you compare their army compared to each European country's army separately, we probably wouldn't stand a week. And Russia, and Hungary and Poland, you're also much closer to Russia as well. So for those reasons, wouldn't you agree with me that there might be a momentum as to maybe try to come closer, or to bring, let's say, the West Europe and East Europe closer to each other, as to find more consensus as to the common, let's say, danger which lies rather close to us? Thank you.
Thank you. Please. Well, maybe okay, this time I can start. So in the Polish society, there is a consensus that Russia is a danger for the European security structures, and there was a consensus already after 2022. So there was not a big problem. There was somehow an intent of the older government, right, to make a commission and to check the influence of Russia on Donald Tusk, who I just presented. Due to the American pressure mainly, also the European pressure, this committee was resolved. It was not influential in the elections. However, this is also very important because we talk here about 20 years in the European Union. For Poland, the integration into the NATO was always more important than into the European Union. Why? Now, because Poland was part of the Warsaw Pact, right? And Poland always, the Polish elites always were afraid that Russia maybe after it gets through this period of economic weakness in the 90s, right, under Boris Yeltsin, then with Vladimir Putin, that it gets stronger, it will have again appetite, right, to reconstruct its former sphere of influence. Therefore, Poland was one of the first countries which really fulfilled, and this one of the public also mentioned it, Donald Trump, 2% of GDP for the NATO. Poland is right now by 4.5. It's on the second position, right? And Poland somehow, and this is maybe what the Germans don't like so much, pushed also the Germans and other Western countries to grow their military spending. So I think there is already one influence of the Polish governments, even in the past, even if it was with backsliding governments. However, this is maybe an influence which Western Europe doesn't like, right? Because still the funding is going from Western Europe to Eastern Europe, and the Eastern Europeans say, okay, you should spend more money on security. This is a very interesting question. Thank you.
And when it comes to this NATO 2%, let's say, when you look at the map, you can see that those European countries that are external borders of the NATO, let's say Poland, Romania, and Hungary as well, they are reaching and then increasing this 2% spending, and Hungary is not an exemption, is an example to that. But on the other hand, politically or from from political and historical point of view, it's different because Hungary's position towards Ukraine is a little bit complicated because, for example, the minority community living there, it's hard to have like an opinion that is not in favor of their status or it's endangering their status in the country. But your original question, I think, was that I think that there is going to be a change in this situation because the front is changing very, very rapidly, and sooner or later there must be a solution to this question.
Excellent. We have perhaps time for one more if there's any missing question you'd like to ask. No? Okay, then maybe I'll ask it myself. Then. No, and one thing that I think it should be missing, it's missing in the discussion, but I think it would benefit from some more clarity from you is what you mentioned at the beginning, linking it to the thinking of Ivan Krastev, right? And this idea that you need not to emulate others, but you need to also reinforce your position within Europe to defend, here I'm going a bit beyond Ivan Krastev, but to defend your country's position within the European Union. But of course, that is a double-edged sword, right? I mean, because by doing that, you can also endanger the unity of the European Union and thus the capacity of the European Union to be an actor, right? And precisely, Poland, previous to the current government, and Hungary still under Orban, have on many occasions played the role of taking the best possible outcome out of the negotiations in Brussels, no matter what the general outcome for the European Union should be. We've seen that with the Middle East peace process recently in Hungary. We've seen that with the cohesion fund. We've seen that with the pandemic recovery fund. We've seen that with the struggle with the European Commission on the funding. So what is, according to both your views, the best way to manage those tensions between Brussels, let's call it this way, and capitals, in this case, your two capitals?
I mean, what we saw, or what we still see in Hungary is somehow, right, there were some successes, there were some positive things which happened in Central and Eastern Europe. However, now this was the first time a real attack on the rule of law of the European Union. And the European Union is based on the rule of law, and both governments showed somehow, but maybe there are some problems in the treaties, right? But this European Union in law questions relies on cooperation, right? The treaties don't say clearly, right, that the European, now when we compare, for example, European law with national law, there are some problems. Now the German Constitutional Court 2020, when it went against the ruling of the European Court about coronavirus funding. Now, there were always sometimes tensions, and maybe this is good. But we have seen through this peace Fidesz attack where the problems are in the European structure, and maybe we can try to fix it before there are other attacks. If there are maybe more member states which are not happy with the treaties as they are right now.
Excellent.
Maybe the last meeting of the V4 prime ministers could be mentioned as a good example, I don't know. But there was this meeting between them, and what we were able to read in the media, that despite it was a very highly tensioned discussion between these four prime ministers, at least they sat down and discussed these issues. So I agree with that communication, and sometimes these kind of, let's say, hard situations can somehow move forward the whole idea of the European Union in a longer term.
Okay. If I may add something, so right now, in the last 2 years, there were freezing of European Union funding, right? They froze funding of the Polish state, they froze funding of the Hungarian state. This is not really effective. However, this is effective in one point. All the member states which want to follow the Hungarian or former Polish example, they know that the funding can be frozen. So maybe it will help them from the beginning. So we'll make them think already before that. So I think we did already this step. Even if this funding, freezing of the funding maybe right now is not so effective, it is effective, right? Because other member states maybe will think twice.
Okay, excellent. We've been very disciplined on time, so thank you very much to both of you for sharing your views. From my side, it's only to conclude by thanking, of course, the three speakers, Sven, Adam, and Agnes, for being here, for joining us in this Europe Talks series of events that we've organized together with the Belgian consulate here on the occasion of the Belgian presidency of the Council of the European Union. And let me remind the audience, since you will not be here, I will be speaking in Spanish, but for you it's not a problem. Pero la última sesión de este ciclo tiene lugar precisamente el día 18 de junio, así que en poco más de un mes, en el que haremos un homenaje a Jacques Delors y tendremos ocasión también de hacer un momento de celebración, de clausura de la presidencia belga y debatiremos precisamente hasta qué punto en los desafíos actuales de Europa el método Delors, ¿no?, el llamado método Delors, sigue siendo una buena fórmula para avanzar en la integración europea. Perdón. Esto será el martes 18 de junio a las 6 de la tarde, así que están todos invitados e invitadas, así que muchas gracias y un placer que nos hayan acompañado.